technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View. Of course, also, it is the first day of July. And so, as we said yesterday, of course, we finished off our fiscal year. And thank you very much to those of you that actually sent in a donation or have pledged it. And we did make our match. And again, we just have great appreciation for those of you that are listeners and have been involved in this ministry. And so we do say thank you for all that you do. Let me today give you kind of an overview, because as we get into the month of July, we will have a lot of things to talk about, not the least of which next hour we'll get into the 4th of July. We will have William Federer with us as we talk about the history of Independence Day and do some things also about America's godly heritage, as well as this whole concerning survey that came out from Gallup about the decreasing and, I don't know what else we could say, diminished patriotism in America, although I think I've been able to discover some of the reasons for that, so we will talk about that next hour. This hour, after some things in the news, we do want to talk about Iran. First of all, there is the Iranian threat, which we want to talk about briefly, and then we'll talk with Lana Silk. She is with an organization called Transform Iran. She's been on with us once before, and as we think about Iran, we certainly do not dislike the people of Iran. I, matter of fact, know quite a few that have left from Iran and are Persians living in America. And we certainly don't wish anything other than for them to have the same kind of freedom and representative government that we enjoy, but that is not what they have right now. And certainly Iran as a country, especially under the mullahs, are a great threat to freedom around the world. So we'll talk about that with her, and I think you will appreciate that as well. Okay, we've mentioned the big, beautiful bill, but I do want to get into a couple of aspects of that, not the least of which is my first article comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, because they are concerned that so often we maybe even have a disinformation campaign, certainly a misinformation campaign, which is aided in part by the way the Congressional Budget Office does their accounting. And only in Washington, D.C., and maybe a few state capitals, can, when you actually increase spending, it's still considered a cut. And we'll get into that. First of all, the editors put it this way. Yesterday, of course, in the Senate, a vote-a-rama on all sorts of amendments to the tax bill, scheduled to go deep into the night. Of course, we still have it unfolding right before our very eyes. Questions about whether some of these key Republican senators in Alaska, North Carolina, Kentucky will vote for it, which is sad, because you shouldn't have to worry just about Republicans. You should also be concerned about Democrats, because seriously, does anybody think that this particular tax cut that has been implemented back in 2017 would not be extended? I mean, even the Democrats would want to extend some part of that, you would think. And so that is, I think, one of those interesting issues. But the editorial board really wants to take on a bigger issue, and that is, if you've heard it once, you've heard it dozens of times if you're out in the media like I am, and that is that this particular bill will increase the federal deficit by $3.3 trillion in 10 years. That is not true, but let's talk about how they come up with such a bizarre number, which is not based on reality at all. And part of it has to, as I've just mentioned a minute ago, how the way the office of the Congressional Budget Office scores a bill, because that would only be true if you make the assumption that Congress was never going to extend the tax cuts that were implemented in 2017. And thus you would assume as your baseline that we would have a $4.5 trillion tax increase. And as I tried to point out, Congress was not going to allow that. Even Democrats would support the extending of most of those individual cuts because if no other reason, that would affect working class Americans. So the argument that this is the baseline is fallacious, but once you start there, it just like a row of dominoes falls the wrong direction. As they say, in any rational world, changes in the law would be scored against current policy. But in Washington, they're scored against CBO's, that's the Congressional Budget Office's current line baseline, which assumes the tax cuts would expire, and thus you have a $3.3 trillion deficit, which will blow the hole in the deficit. By the way, I'm not saying that what we have in front of us is the best bill. It's full of entirely too many compromises, and you can see the back and forth between Elon Musk and Donald Trump to get a feel for that, not to mention the back and forth between Democrats and Republicans in the United States Senate. But here's another interesting thing. Once you start with that, you also have something else, because if you really are honest, the Congressional Budget Office does estimate the Senate bill would actually save $500 billion, or $500 billion, $500 billion over 10 years, because the spending reductions would offset some of the increased cost. And those are the things we've talked about before, because Donald Trump wanted no taxes on, let's say it together, overtime, tips, even auto loan interest. And there would also be, of course, this increase, which originally was of $10,000, now up to $40,000 on what's called the SALT cap. That stands for the state and local tax deductions that people in certain high-tax states receive. But interesting enough, you want to use that SALT deduction, then because that was supposed to disappear at the end of the year, this $40,000 cap would then actually be listed as reducing the deficit by $944 billion over 10 years. You know, after a while, you just have to say, can we come up with an accounting system that is like the accounting system that you and I use in our ministry, in our businesses, even in our homes? But nevertheless, that is the case. And as they point out then finally, the way in which the Congressional Budget Office uses this baseline forecast, it then allows Democrats to claim that the reforms will actually slow spending growth on such things as Medicaid. And yet, interestingly enough, Medicaid is going to increase in terms of spending, but because it's not tied to the automatic increase, it is seen as a cut. As I've said before, only in Washington, D.C., where I'm going to spend more on a program this year, coming year, than I do in this year, that still could be considered a cut. And so, again, they go on to say that the Senate bill, for all its faults, is the first serious attempt at entitlement reform. It deals with Medicaid, food stamps, student loans, many things we've talked about before. But as they conclude, there is much in the Republican bill in the Senate that deserves criticism, but the $3.3 trillion deficit critique is phony, just like Beltway accounting. So I put that up there in case you wanted to know about this. I know sometimes when we get into the deep weeds, some people's eyes kind of glaze over, and we'll leave it at that. But sometimes you hear these phrases about this is going to add $3.3 trillion to the deficit, and that is based upon a phony accounting system, which, quite frankly, we need to fix. Anyway, let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Here's an encouraging statistic. The murder rate in our country is plummeting. We still have about half of the year left, but if the trend continues, FBI Director Kash Patel says the U.S. is on track to have the lowest murder rate ever. John Lott is the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center and has been on the Point of View radio program many times. He has two explanations. First, law enforcement matters. Second, deporting criminal illegal aliens has an impact. The FBI director has been telling law enforcement, I'm going to let you, the agents, the police officers, the sheriffs, go out there and do the work you badly want to do, and I'm going to give you the resources you need to do it. He decided to move a third of the FBI agents in the D.C. area to places across the country where crime is occurring. This is different from the previous administration, where FBI agents were sometimes focused on non-criminal activities of conservative Catholics or parents speaking out at school board meetings. John Lott has a simple explanation. When you let law enforcement catch criminals, it makes it riskier for criminals to commit crime. You end up getting less crime. Now, deporting criminal illegal aliens also has lowered the crime rate. Many of them already had criminal backgrounds, but were nevertheless released into society. He also mentions that deportations are forcing illegal aliens to lay low. When you fear an ICE roundup, you're more likely to stay home. John Lott concludes, reducing crime isn't rocket science. If you make it riskier for criminals to commit crime, you get less crime. No, it isn't that complicated. If you want less crime, put more police on the streets and take more criminals off the streets. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to be talking about Iran in just a minute. And of course, we'll be talking with Lana Silk about that as well. So that will be our focus. But I thought just before we get to that, when you look at right now, there's a ceasefire. There have been 2 peace treaties, which I suspect you probably are hearing about for the first time because the press doesn't like to cover things that are done under the Trump administration. And it brings us back to one of the questions that some people are seriously asking. That is, when the Nobel Committee gathers together, who should they give the Nobel Peace Prize to? And there have been a number of people that say they should give it to Donald Trump. Okay, we know that's not going to happen just because of the political bias there, but it brings me to a key point, and that is the other day watching CNN, there was a back and forth about the peace treaty between Rwanda and the Congo, and one of the individuals there, and I won't say her name, but you can look it up, confidently claimed that there was no peace treaty, whereas upon the lone conservative there on the panel said, are you just not watching the news? This actually did take place. And this was actually covered in the Oval Office of the White House. But nevertheless, that is the case. The other day, you had the Rwandan foreign minister, I won't even try to pronounce his last name, who actually was with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and in the Oval Office said that he is convinced that Donald Trump absolutely deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in helping bring an end to the bloody 30-year conflict. And that is something which has been going on, as you can certainly do the math, for 30 years, going back into the 1990s, which was a big issue back then, which we covered, and the conflict between Rwanda and the Congo. And this, of course, is now coming to an end. And it is something that I've used occasionally as an illustration of some of my commentary. Now, interestingly enough, Matthew Boyle puts it this way. Rwanda is hardly alone in believing that Donald Trump should finally get the historic award. Pakistan formally pushed for Trump to get it as well after Donald Trump's work in negotiating the end to the hostilities between Pakistan and India, and many others pushed for it as well. In fact, several members of Congress have formally introduced resolutions supporting Trump for the prize, but hearing this from parties to peace agreements that Trump had negotiated like this makes an overwhelmingly compelling case that he should get the award. Don't think it's going to happen. I live in the real world. I know you do as well, but I thought I'd mention it. But let's, if we can, hear for just another minute from the Rwandan foreign minister who said this. Quote, "It was my first time in the Oval Office. Not my first time in the White House, but my first time in the Oval Office. And it was an honor, of course, to meet President Trump, which was not expected because we were expecting to sign the agreement in the State Department." That might have been where something like that would have taken place. But, you know, ever the showman, Donald Trump wanted to bring attention to that. But also they went on to make a very strong statement that this wasn't just something that Donald Trump wanted to do just to make a show, but he actually was interested and involved in it as well. He goes on to say, quote, "This shows that he really is. He has this agreement at heart. It was, of course, impressive to spend an hour-long press conference when we discussed, of course, this situation in Eastern NRC, which is, of course, the Congo, and, of course, the historic movement and moment in which we're living. So we appreciate his personal involvement, which he demonstrated yesterday by his invitation of the two foreign ministers to come to the Oval Office to have this press conference together. And we hope the United States and President Trump in particular will stay committed to the process and helping parties in implementing the agreement because now is the time of implementation." Goes on and makes a number of other statements, but I just wanted you to know that whether it is the, if you will, the peace treaty, if you will, between India and Pakistan, or the peace treaty now between what is the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, and Rwanda, you have a number of those things which certainly would be covered, I suspect, more effectively by the legacy press if you had a different president in the Oval Office, but you may have actually been hearing about this particular peace agreement for the first time here on Point of View, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up. Okay, we're going to focus some time on Iran. Again, let's just make it very clear. We are against the policies of the Iranian leadership. We're not against the people of Iran, but we're also very concerned that some of these people from Iran that have come to this country did not come here because they wanted to just seek the best of American life. Some of them have, I think, some very dangerous ideas in their minds. And Noah Rothman, in our second article here, puts it this way. If it ever faced a real threat to its existence, the Islamic Republic has been suspected of having the capability to activate its terror cells in the West, according to Iran watchers. Although the ceasefire between Tehran, Israel, and the United States appears durable, the hazards posed by Iran's asymmetric capabilities persist. Here he quotes from something in what is called the Jewish Insider, in which the official said Iran also reportedly sent a message to President Donald Trump days before the U.S. strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities, threatening to activate a terrorist network inside the United States if the U.S. struck Iran. That comes from NBC News. The Department of Homeland Security also published a public bulletin in which they warned that the conflict in Iran could prompt attacks in the United States and that a specific direction from Iran's religious leadership could increase the likelihood of homegrown violent extremist mobilization. It also warned of potential cyber attacks. A lot of these warnings come because, guess what? We have arrested. Are you ready for this number? 130 Iranian nationals since the start of direct hostilities between Iran and the United States. Now, some of those detainees are maybe less likely to threaten us. They may not pose a great threat to U.S. national security, but others may. And so, again, if the Iranian government assets were to sweep up these raids, it would not be the first time law enforcement rolled up active Iranian cells on American soil. So again, there's also been the concern as well from the National Security Administration that indeed Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard affiliated cyber actors, including people that are hackers and others, may try to target U.S. devices and networks in a near-term cyber operation or cyber attack. It advises critical infrastructure asset owners to review their security posture and assess their weaknesses before it's too late. And again, the president is taking these threats seriously. So are the people at the National Security Council. And I thought it is important to mention that. Again, Noah Rothman concludes by saying Iran's asymmetric and terroristic capabilities may have been overhyped, that's quite possible, by those who sought to avert the U.S. strike on Tehran's nuclear targets. But the threat is not imaginary, he says. The Iranian nuclear program was an expression of the Islamic Republic's menace, not the threat itself. Iran will continue to imperil the West for as long as the regime remains in power. So when we come back from the break, we're going to spend some time talking with Lana Silk about what they're doing to reach out to those in Iran. Many believe that the fastest growing church in the world right now is in Iran, and there is a rising house church movement there. And this, of course, sometimes comes with threats to those individuals who are new believers, young believers. We in the past have even tried to raise funds here at Point of View for the Iranian Bible School, which, by the way, is not held in Iran, as you might gather, but they were able to sneak people out to nearby countries to train pastors, because imagine of a country full of young converts, but very little theological training, oftentimes maybe not even having access to a Bible, or even if they only have a Bible, nothing more than that, no commentaries, none other kind of pastoral advice and information and encouragement. So we will be talking with her about the organization Transform Iran, and that information is on our website. Let me mention that we still have the opportunity for you to support this ministry as we now head into a new fiscal year. You can click on that button that says Give Now. We have some take action items. We have our video. My Viewpoints commentary today about the murder rate is going down so fast. And again, we're only halfway through the year, but if this rate continues, we will have the lowest murder rate ever. There are some reasons for that. You can read my commentary to find that out. But let's take a break. When we come back, let me again encourage you to find some of these articles we've already mentioned, some of the others we're going to mention, a book later on next hour we're going to talk about as well. All of that is available at the website pointofview.net. Click on that, get that information, and while you're there, if you can make a donation, we would appreciate it. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we talk so often about Iran, and there are very good reasons for that. First of all, we like to talk about some of the ministries taking place to really reach out to the Iranian people. But also, of course, lately we have been dealing with that because of the various strikes that have taken place, first from Israel and then from the United States. And so we do have a link to transformiran.com. You'll see a whole section here about Iranians react to the airstrikes. We're going to be talking about this outreach that exists, and we welcome back to the microphone Lana Silk. She is the Chief Executive Officer for Transform Iran. She completed, first of all, I might just mention that she was born and raised in Iran, completed her education in the UK, and really is looking forward to the day in which God's purposes are fulfilled in Iran, certainly a land that still has her heart. And so, Lana, welcome back to Point of View.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Let's, if we can, first of all, for anybody that doesn't remember our conversation with you, because it's been more than a year, about your organization, because between you and your parents, you've always had a real desire to reach out to the Iranian people, the Persians that are there. So if you can, give us an overview of the organization, and we, of course, have a link to the website right here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Yes. Transform Iran is really everything that it says in the name. The heart, the passion, the mission and vision is about transforming this beautiful country and really reaching all the Iranians with the love and the power of Jesus Christ. We know they have lived a very difficult life under the regime of Iran the last 45, 46 years, even harder the last few weeks at a time of war. And we know, of course, that Jesus is the only real hope for all of us, and we want to be able to introduce that to them. So we do a lot of work in evangelism and discipleship, in church planting, leadership development, and also some transformational projects around trauma, addiction, prostitution, and by God's grace, we will see our country redeemed.
One of the things we oftentimes say about Iran is that even though it is one of those countries more hostile to the gospel, hostile to Christianity, it seems to be the place where Christianity is growing the fastest. And I've heard many people say that the Iranian church may be the fastest growing church in the world. What about that?
Yeah, it's kind of a cool statistic, isn't it? I don't know how that got measured. It really does ring true. I mean, Iran's church is certainly very rapidly growing. I wouldn't be surprised if it really was the fastest growing church in the world today. There is such an openness and such a hunger to hear the gospel and to respond positively to it. People want to know something different. You know, Islam is over in Iran. Really, it's hard to believe when we say these words, but the reality shows it on the ground in the country, where the only people who are openly committing, or I should say by far the only people who are openly committing to an Islamic faith, are associated with the government or employed by the government. The regular person in Iran today has really been jaded by the Islamic Republic's establishment in 1979 and is looking actively for an alternative to that, because they are spiritual people. They believe in God, they want to follow and please God, and they're looking for a way to do that. And as Christians, if we're ready for that, we are there to reap a wonderful harvest for God's glory.
Let's, if we can, maybe get into the airstrikes. And that is, again, one of the links that you have on your website, some of the articles that appeared in CBN News. And again, that I think is interesting because, as it says, surprising public reaction and a sobering aftermath. So as people go to your website, I would encourage them to scroll down. They can then see some of the video, some of the questions, some of the interaction. But talk about that, because last time we had you on, of course, we hadn't had airstrikes either from Israel or the United States. And now this is, in some respects, a very different Middle East, and very sobering to think about what might be happening in the future in Iran. Can you share with us what you think might be taking place?
It's been a very dramatic couple of weeks in Iran with a constantly evolving range of emotions and reactions to the situation, and the plight of the people in the country has been serious. And you're absolutely right there, Kerby. It was really quite surprising, even for us on the inside, to see the openness with which the Iranian people celebrated those early strikes on their own country. Lots of messages of thanks to Israel, personal messages of thanks even to Prime Minister Netanyahu, thanking him for finally taking action. And, even taking to comedy, I've seen cartoons of memes of different characters playing out okay, great, now you've started it, let's finish it, come on, let's finish the job. People were very excited that perhaps this could really be the end of their suffering. Within a few days, it was a little more of the same, but also a little tempered by the fact that they were living in what was wartime really then for them. Lots of air raids, lots of evacuations, shortages of food, electricity, water, gas. That's day-to-day realities for people then. And despite how badly they want to be free of their government, they're also considering survival in the short term. We're now on the other side of it. The ceasefire has perhaps been the worst possible thing for the Iranian people. I'm sure many of the listeners will find that surprising to hear. When you wound an animal badly and then walk away, that animal is even more dangerous than he was before being wounded.
Yes.
And so we are in that situation now in Iran, a government that has been really publicly humiliated, that they're very careful to play, good political games and talk a good talk about how this was victory and didn't hurt them at all, but it was an international humiliation. And now at a time of ceasefire, the Iranian government have the opportunity to catch their breath, to rearm themselves, to position themselves for continued battle, and to take their anger and their frustration out on their own people who are now being hauled in their hundreds and interrogated and questioned for espionage. People have already been executed. It's really tough life in Iran today.
What can we do to support your organization and the believers in Iran? Because it does seem to me that in some respects it's gone from bad to worse for some of the believers there.
It really has, Kerby. It's very tough. I was speaking to one of our senior pastors this morning, and she was telling me how a lot of members, even of her own family back in the country, were describing raids on houses nearby, and just police just literally unannounced turning up at different people's homes, going through all their materials, checking all their data. Christians are deleting a lot of data right now to sort of circumvent any upcoming arrest. So pray for them, pray for their safety, pray for their continued courage, pray for hope, pray against fear. There is this tendency to be fearful, and we know that fear is not of God. The Word of God tells us perfect love casts out all fear. And this is now the enemy's playground. He wants to create fear and anxiety and self-doubt in the situation in any way that he can derail Christians and weaken their resolve. He will do it. So let's pray against his agenda and pray for the Christians to continue to remain strong. The joy of the Lord is their strength. So let's declare these scriptures over them. And we welcome help. We're now getting ready to respond for humanitarian crisis. We have a lot of need. There's a shortage of funds in the country, and the funds are already there, are hard to access right now. We're anticipating that to change. The banks have closed their doors to people. Regular folk can't access their own bank accounts or savings because there's such a fear of all that will come as an aftermath of what Iran has experienced these last 2 weeks. So pray for them, pray for us, and help us if you can.
Let me just mention, we're going to take a break, but there's a couple other buttons that you can click on there. One for donations, and obviously there is some real significant needs there. And then there's a newsletter in which you can stay up to date with what God is doing in Iran, and also then we'll see some of the various prayer targets, prayer projects, project advancements, opportunities for you to get involved. And again, this is the organization in the United States, but they also have offices in the Netherlands and the UK, where Lana actually also did study. And so we're going to take a break, and we'll come back and talk about some other ways we can get involved. But let me, as we go to the break, encourage you either to go to the website, pointofview.net, and click on the link, or you can just go directly to transformiran.com. And we do want to talk briefly about what they are doing in country in terms of evangelism and discipleship, and as well some of the transformation and teaching. Also a very good piece that you can watch at your leisure, or maybe even share with your Sunday school class about what has been happening, some of the reaction to the airstrikes that have taken place, first from Israel, then from the United States, and what is happening now in terms of that ceasefire. But let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Lana Silk. And as I mentioned before, next hour we're going to get into some other topics, including our great interview with William Federer. But if you have an interest in some of this, let me, during the break, encourage you to go to the website and maybe sign up for their newsletter, find out a little bit more about what you can do to pray for them. And we'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Lana Silk with us for a few more minutes. And again, I thought it would be helpful, Lana, for maybe you to talk about the various ways in which you are involved with individuals there in Iran. And as you mentioned before, you have evangelism, discipleship, and transformation. Can you kind of share just an overview of some of the things that you're doing, and once again, how we can help you be more effective?
Thank you. Yes, we talk about those three pillars as our main focus as a ministry, and really it's a good help for us internally as well to make sure that everything we do falls into one of those activities. So evangelism is, of course, the Great Commission, and also inspired by the fact that the Word tells us, how can they believe if they have not heard? We want to make sure that every person in Iran, whether they are male or female, young or old, educated or illiterate, in big metropolitan cities or isolated out in the hills, they all have access to the Word of God. They all have it in a way that makes sense to them, that they can relate to, really resonate with them, and that they can then respond to it. So we put out a lot of different material with that in mind, using different media, social media, radio, satellite TV, multiple different websites. We have an interactive apologetics center where they can come and ask their questions and interact with the system to help them really understand the answers to their questions, the intersection between Islam and Christianity. These are the questions on their minds. They want to understand why Jesus claimed the things he did. How is it that we think he is God? So we put a lot of effort into making sure that they've had an opportunity to understand these things. But then when they turn to Jesus, the call is to make disciples and not converts. So that takes us to our second pillar. And there we are really focused on making sure people have the opportunity to get rooted in the Word of God, connect with Christian family. We have a digital church network that draws 20 to 25,000 people every month, and probably millions more who dabble and just want to see what's going on in learning about the Christian faith, being part of Christian meetings, all in a safe environment for people who are in Iran, who are very persecuted. So we have different ways to connect them so they're not exposed, but they can still learn from other Christians, be part of worship, receive teaching, and grow in discipleship. We have counselors that will call them every week and walk them through a whole curriculum that will root them in the Word and help them grow. And as they do, we end up developing them as leaders, helping them as they plant churches, as they reach others, and continuing to resource and strengthen them. And other things then come into play. We have a Bible college and different ways in which we want to make sure that they're growing. And then the transformation part is about making sure that we don't stay in holy huddles in Iran. We want to be Christians who are light on a hill, who are reaching our communities, making sure that those communities are truly transformed with the power of the gospel. And we're mindful of the different needs then in those communities. There's a lot of need in Iran. There's an alarming rate of a mental health crisis with depression, anxiety, suicide. There's addiction, prostitution, a lot of abuse happens. So we want to make sure they're providing people the kind of care that is relevant to their needs and being practical in the love that we show them as well.
One of the things I know that you talk about is that there was some 26 million Iranians who do not have the Word of God in their own heart language. And so there's really a need to get those resources to them. And, of course, to use the media outlets, which you have so many more than we used to have, to reach them. So it seems to me that that's a very key starting point for individuals that really would want to pray and to support you in some way.
Yes, absolutely. We talked about this fast-growing church earlier on your show, and the reality is that when we start diving deeper, we find that growth is actually limited to the 45% or so of Iranians who would speak Farsi as their heart language in their homes. The rest of the country is by and large unreached, and there's a lot of work still to do in making sure that when we communicate the gospel to them, we're not using Farsi, which is the language of the country, the language of oppression and control, but rather their own language, which really dignifies them and shows how much we love and value them in the way that we're caring to communicate with them. And we have a lot of work still there to do there, Kerby, in actually producing the resources and then setting up the channels of communication. So we welcome help for that. It's an exciting thing to get involved in because you can see the results right away. You know that if you've, sewn into Bible translation and then, there's a New Testament in this language now, in that language, you've been part of making that happen, and that's very encouraging.
Yes. One other thing I thought I'd just mention as well, you do have a Bible college. It's an online Bible college, and that is a place which I certainly want people to know about and to support as well, because we have certainly quite a number of individuals that are converts, but we want them to grow. And, of course, at a time when there's so much oppression, it is difficult to learn that, but nothing else to give them any kind of important theological lessons and to make sure that we maintain the doctrinal integrity of the church. Those are things that I know you're focused on as well, aren't you?
Yes, exactly right. I mean, you summed it up so well. It is a concern. When a church grows so quickly and is so young, you have to be extra diligent to make sure that heresy doesn't creep in, and people can go off track very easily, especially when their worldview isn't even Christian. Their background is a completely different mindset in terms of how they understand God behaves and treats us and wants to relate to us and what his expectations of us are. There's a lot of rethinking to be done there. And so we're very careful and diligent in making sure that as people turn to Jesus, they really get to learn the truths of our faith, who he is, how to relate to him. A lot of things that we might take for granted in the West, like what worship looks like, what prayer looks like, what Christian family looks like. It's really such a joy to be able to share this with our Iranian brothers and sisters, but also to do it purposefully to make sure that the church grows strong and healthy.
So again, I would certainly encourage you to learn more about Transform Iran and make that a prayer target. Just before I let you go, Lana, anything else you'd like to share with our listeners? Because it does seem to me that we have Iran on our hearts right now simply because of some of the airstrikes and also because we've learned so much more about people in that country, the persecution that believers are facing, but also the incredible amount of explosion that is taking place inside that country in terms of faith.
Yes, I was reminded of something this morning that I'd love to encourage you with. A few months ago, we had a 24-hour prayer and fasting day together with our Christian brothers and sisters in the country, where we all set some time aside to pray. And those who were in the country went on prayer walks in their vicinities and recorded themselves praying, not face to camera, just recorded where they were standing, praying over key sites over the country and praying for God's kingdom to be established. And, that happened a few months ago. And, we pray sometimes and we forget how powerful those prayers are, particularly when they are focused, targeted in accordance with God's will and in unity with other believers. And yet this morning I was reminded that some of those brothers and sisters in the country who had gone on those prayer walks had gone specifically to locations that they knew were strongholds of the enemy in the country. One of those was Evin Prison, where a lot of Christians have been tortured in that prison. A lot of dissidents, quote unquote, of the government have been arrested and kept there in solitary confinement for a long time. And the other was what we call it's translated as a sound and vision center. It's like the broadcasting center of the country. And again, a lot of evil content has come out of that place, propaganda, as well as forced confessions of people who've been arrested. And Christians stood outside these places and declared the sovereignty of the Lord, that his kingdom should come on earth as it is in heaven. And now, a few months down the road, both of those places have been bombed by Israeli forces. We mustn't forget that God hears our prayers, and there are some very specific, practical things that he does in response to when we pray. So let's keep praying. Let's be encouraged. God is on the throne.
Very good. Lana, thank you for being with us. We're going to take a break and come back with more right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This week is, of course, 4th of July week, because at the end of the week is the 4th of July. By the way, we'll be playing a tape, which we've already recorded in the past, on that particular day. And I thought it would be very appropriate to bring back an individual who's been on the program so many times, William Federer, who is an individual who has been able to really dig out and ferret out all sorts of incredible stories about our history. He is the author of more than 20 books, about 500,000 copies of his book, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, has been featured for many years, and you perhaps have heard his radio feature, American Minute, also his TV program, Faith in History. And I also posted on the website here, Miracles in American History, which really are a compilation by Susie Federer from his American Minute, because as we go through some of these stories, you might say, well, is there some place where I can read some of that? And that is certainly one of many books. Of course, we have a link to his website. And Bill Federer, always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, great to be with you.
Let's, if we can, just let you sit back and tell us the history of Independence Day. I was sharing some things off air with the death of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and a variety of other things, but I think it is a great story, and it's one that, of course, is recounted in Miracles in American History, isn't it?
Well, it is, and when we look at the big picture, the King of England was a globalist. He was a one-world government guy. The sun never set on the British Empire. He had India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guiana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, and America. And America's founders decided they didn't like a globalist king telling us what to do, so they broke away and flipped it, made the people the king. And so kings have subjects who are subjected to their will. Republics have citizens, and the word citizen is Greek. It means co-ruler, co-sovereign, co-king. So America is an experiment of a bottom-up form of government, where the norm for world history is a top-down form of government. And from the beginning of recorded history, you have the Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun. It's all kings. And if you're friends with the king, you're more equal. If you're not friends with the king, you're less equal. If you're an enemy of the king, you're dead or you're a slave. It's like, and the king is a glorified gang leader. So it's this gang structure that keeps getting bigger, and America's founders broke away. And then, of course, where did they get their idea? From the New England pastors and their little congregational covenant form of government, who got their idea from the Reformation, who got their idea from the Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400 years out of Egypt before they got a king. It's called the Hebrew Republic. There's this anomaly in world history from around 1400 B to 1000 BC of millions of Israelites and no king. And it worked because every citizen was taught the law, and they were personally accountable to God to follow it. And so it worked in Israel until the priests went woke and stopped teaching the law, and every man did what was right in their own eyes. It turns into chaos. They go to Samuel. They ask for a king. Why is this story important? The kings of Europe looked to the Bible, but they looked to the King Saul and on part of the Bible. And the Puritans that founded New England looked to the pre-King Saul part of the Bible. This millions of people, this Hebrew Republic. And so when you look at the founders, they realized they were doing something unique in world history. And even, there's the George Washington during the Revolution, when the soldiers hadn't been paid for a couple of years. There's the Newburgh Conspiracy. And they were going to talk about going into the Capitol in New York City and taking over the government, and Washington shows up unannounced, pulls a little piece of paper out of his pocket, puts on his glasses that nobody had ever seen him wear before. He called them his spectacles. And he said, "Excuse me while I put these on. I've grown blind in the service of my country." And then he talks about how all their friends bled and died, and if they go in there, storm, and set up a military dictatorship, all of it will be for naught. We'll be back where we left with the king. And so he pulls up the paper, puts it in his pocket, and leaves, and that Newburgh conspiracy dissolves. They knew that they were doing something unique and letting the people be in charge of their lives. Kings have subjects who are subjected to their will. Republics have citizens. And the word citizen means co-king. And so when you look at the revolution, the founders realized that we were breaking away from the most powerful king on the planet. Earlier this week, I was speaking in New York and met a guy from Bengal. And I said, "Hey, did you know there probably wouldn't have been a revolution if it had not been for a famine in Bengal in 1770 that killed 10 million people?" He's like, "What?" I go, "Yeah, the British East India Company took over Bengal, rearranged their entire economy, and they shifted it up so that the people hadn't planted and prepared for their monsoons and famines, and 10 million people died. And the British East India Company was going bankrupt, so they appealed to the government for a government bailout. We're familiar with government bailing out businesses. And so the king said, "Okay, yeah, you can make it up in taxes to the British people." And the British people said, "Well, we don't want the taxes." And the king says, "Okay, tax the colonies, and then cut out the middlemen. And then we'll confiscate ships of those trying to smuggle stuff into the country and not going through us. And we'll stop the country from printing their own currency. And we'll leave the troops over there left over from the French and Indian War. And since there's no barracks, we'll put the troops in the people's homes. And then we'll read through all their emails." Of course, they didn't have emails, but it's called the writs of assistance. They could read through everybody's mail, and they could confiscate anybody's property on suspicion. And then it started to heat up, and America's founders, they had about a century of practicing self-government because, Europe was the chessboard that the kings were fighting over. America was a losing investment. I mean, 500 people died in Jamestown, Virginia. We didn't have gold. We had tobacco and dried fish and beaver skins. Well, it wasn't a moneymaker. And so the King of England was like, "Don't bother me. Just stay out of my hair for a century." Well, we got a chance to develop this self-government. And so when the king decides to crack down, we had a taste of freedom that we pushed back. And so Thomas Jefferson, when he pens the Declaration, he lists about 27 reasons why we were pushing back.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people say, well, were they rebelling? Well, no, actually, the king's the one that started it. He had a two-tiered justice system, made the judges depend on his will alone, erected a new, in other words, imagine going to the judge, and the judge was part of the deep state, and he wouldn't give you fair justice because his paycheck was coming from the king. And then the king incited natives of the frontiers to do terrorist attacks. General Johnny Burgoyne meets with the Mohawk Indians in New York and promises them money for scalps. And so that's listed. It says the king has excited domestic insurrection among us, endeavored to bring the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And
let's take a break real quickly, because I do need to come back real quickly, because I do want to get into where did Thomas Jefferson get his ideas? Some of that came from John Locke. Maybe some of it came from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and maybe even the Mecklenburg Declaration and some of that. So we'll get into the aspect of the Declaration. And then even later on, we have certainly some other great stories about this. But again, we are coming up to next year will be the 250th anniversary of this country, and that's why we thought you'd like to hear from William Federer. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Here's an encouraging statistic. The murder rate in our country is plummeting. We still have about half of the year left, but if the trend continues, FBI Director Kash Patel says the U.S. is on track to have the lowest murder rate ever. John Lott is the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center and has been on the Point of View radio program many times. He has two explanations. First, law enforcement matters. Second, deporting criminal illegal aliens has an impact. The FBI director has been telling law enforcement, I'm going to let you, the agents, the police officers, the sheriffs, go out there and do the work you badly want to do, and I'm going to give you the resources you need to do it. He decided to move a third of the FBI agents in the D.C. area to places across the country where crime is occurring. This is different from the previous administration where FBI agents were sometimes focused on non-criminal activities of conservative Catholics or parents speaking out at school board meetings. John Lott has a simple explanation. When you let law enforcement catch criminals, it makes it riskier for criminals to commit crime. You end up getting less crime. Now, deporting criminal illegal aliens also has lowered the crime rate. Many of them already had criminal backgrounds, but were nevertheless released into society. He also mentions that deportations are forcing illegal aliens to lay low. When you fear an ICE roundup, you're more likely to stay home. John Lott concludes, reducing crime isn't rocket science. If you make it riskier for criminals to commit crime, you get less crime. No, it isn't that complicated. If you want less crime, put more police on the streets and take more criminals off the streets. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
William Federer with us. And again, if you'd like to know a little bit more about his organization, we have a link to AmericanMinute.com. There you can find out about his various books, all the media that is available there. You can sign up, and I would certainly encourage you that if you would like to educate, especially as we come into this 250th anniversary of this country, and maybe like to have him come to speak to your church, your civic group, he will certainly, just as you've already figured out, provide so much news, information, commentary, biblical history tied into what's happening today, because so many times he will point out that what we're dealing with today are similar to some of the things that they were dealing with in the 18th century. But Bill, if we can, I thought it would be helpful for you also to talk about, because I know you do, about where these ideas of the Declaration of Independence came from, and also just one of the questions that believers had at the time, because, you know, we're in Romans 13 supposed to be in subjection to governing authorities, but they said that they were not going to break from England for light and transient causes, because they were suffering a long train of abuses and usurpations. So this was not something that the colonists came to lightly, but we today enjoy the freedom that we have because of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution.
Yeah, they actually, Romans 13, let everyone be subject to the governing authority, for there's no authority except that which God has established. The authority that is just established by God. And it's like, well, who's the governing authority in a monarchy? Well, it's the king. Well, who's the governing authority in a republic? Well, it's the people. The people are the king. The politicians are our servants. So it would be silly for the king to have to obey his servant, right? And so the founders understand, wait, we're empowering the people. So about 32% of the signers, or 32 of the signers of the Declaration were Anglican, 13 Congregationalists, 12 Presbyterians, and then you had Quakers, Baptists, one Roman Catholic, Dutch Reformed. And so, but the Presbyterians, they were known as the resistance party to the king. So we back up. You have the King of England, right, Henry VIII, and then you had the Puritans trying to purify the King of England. You had separatists that turned into the Baptists and Congregationalists, and they were sort of withdrawing. They had a covenant form of government, but they weren't really involved in politics per se. And then the Quakers, they definitely weren't involved in politics, but the Presbyterians, they were in Scotland, and they resisted the king. Jenny Geddes was a market woman who, when they read the first time the English Book of Common Prayer in St. Giles Cathedral in Scotland, she hurled her three-legged stool and it whacks into the minister, and people start throwing stuff. It turns into the Bishop's War, and then the king sends his army up there and has the killing time, starts killing these Presbyterians. And so they were known as the resistance party to the king. And so you began to see John Witherspoon. He is the Scottish guy, comes over, and he teaches at Princeton. And he teaches a good percentage of the signers of the Declaration and Constitution. Uh-huh. And so they're taking this covenant form of government, and they're saying, wait a second, we want to have a government without a king. They actually did have an American experiment in England for 15 years called the English Commonwealth.
Right.
Oliver Cromwell died, and they couldn't keep it together, and they brought back, the king, Charles II. But in America, we were the afterthought. We're the 3,000-mile ocean away, and so we were allowed to develop this. They did get ideas from John Locke, but he sort of drew his ideas sort of removed from the Hebrews Republic. Even Os Guinness said how covenantal ideas in England were the lost cause, but they became the winning cause. In New England, covenant-shaped constitutionalism. The American Constitution is a nationalized, secularized form of covenant. And he says, and the word federal is Latin for covenant. So we have a covenant form of government where we, the people, can rule ourselves without a king. And they got this from the Bible. But one of the interesting things, I don't know if I got into it, but people in the colonies were trying to get rid of slavery.
Yes.
Pre-Revolutionary War. But the King of England wouldn't allow it because he was a part owner of the Royal African Company. And so Thomas Jefferson, who's 33, writes this about the King of England, who was 38. And he says, the king, this is in the Declaration, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself and the persons of a distant people who have never offended him, captivating, carrying them into slavery, other hemisphere, incurable, miserable death, suppression of every legislative attempt to restrain this execrable commerce, to keep a market open where men could be bought and sold. South Carolina and Georgia wouldn't go along with it. And since they said the declaration had to be unanimous and they were all in panic because they got word that the British were invading New York, they went ahead and passed it without getting rid of slavery. How we wish they would have fought it out and gotten rid of slavery right at the beginning of the country. But at least we see that it was in there. Ben Franklin, after the Constitution, he became the first president of the first anti-slavery society. And in 1790, he introduced a petition for Congress to end slavery in America. But again, South Carolina and Georgia wouldn't go along with it. But again, they're taking on the most powerful king on the planet. John Hancock signed the Declaration and then reportedly said, the price on my head has just doubled. The next to sign is Charles Thompson. He's the secretary. He was 47. Ben Franklin was 70. He said, we must hang together, or most assuredly, we will hang separately. The Declaration does mention God 4 times, laws of nature and of nature's God, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, and with all men are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. One of the things I wanted to bring up, 2 months before they did the Declaration, the same Continental Congress passed a day of fasting and prayer unanimously through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ. It's like, oh, they were all deists and atheists. Like, why would they unanimously pass a day of fasting through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ just 2 months before they did their declaration that mentions God 4 times? And so they were all Christian, and there's miracles. I mean, Battle of Brooklyn Heights, August 27th, 1776. The British found a loyalist, somebody in America, but they're not loyal to America. They're loyal to the enemy. I know it's hard for us to believe that type of person ever existed. But this loyalist shows the British how to march through Jamaica Pass all night long and attack Washington from behind. I mean, they're shooting the Americans in the back. Only 300 British died. And then Washington's pinned up against the water. And the sun goes down. And he's probably thinking, the next day I'll be hung and America will be another colony like Sudan or Kenya or someplace. But he gets every boat he can find, and he's ferrying his troops across the East River, gets about half across when the sun starts to come up, and he's only moved half his army. He's really a sitting duck. His chief of intelligence, Ben Talmadge, writes, as the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety. When the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty. At this time, a very dense fog began to rise off the river and settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well. So very dense was the atmosphere, I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards. We tarried until the sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever. So Washington continues to move his troops. He's on the last boat that leaves. The fog lifts, the British charge, nobody's there.
Yep.
It was the
one of
last
great
chance
miracles
the British had to capture.
Yeah. Again, one of the great miracles of American history. I might just point out that you have a Miracles in American History book and DVDs and all that. And since we're just coming to a break, let me just, if I can, mention one more time that your website is AmericanMinute.com. And I would really encourage people, if they've been listening right now saying, I've heard all sorts of things I've not heard before, isn't it possible that somebody can schedule you to come and speak to their civic group or to their church?
Oh, yes. And thank you for mentioning that. Every week I speak all around the country, but I'd be thrilled to speak at any church and any group. Just contact me through my website, AmericanMinute.com.
Again, the website is AmericanMinute.com. We certainly highly recommend, it's on my shelf, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations. Of course, we have a lot of the other ones as well, including Miracles in American History. You've heard some of that, God and Country, all sorts of great resources there. So I just wanted to kind of kick it off. And Bill Federer, we'll have you on again because this 250th anniversary of America is kind of something we're going to talk about. But I want you today to talk a little bit about the Declaration and Independence Day, and it's been great to have you on the program, and let's do it again.
I look forward to it, Kirby. Thank you so much.
Let's take a break. When we come back, just a few follow-up issues. While we talk about America's heritage, I do want to get into the need for us to maybe rekindle patriotism. And I don't know if you've seen this, but this just came out from Gallup poll. I'd heard about it, but now I'll show you, on those of you that are watching online, some of the graphs. We have the record low in terms of American adults and their pride in America. But I want to talk about that because I think somebody gets back to the need for us to talk about America's godly heritage and some of the benefits of being an American. We'll talk about that right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to be spending just a few more minutes talking about this fact that we're in the, if you might call it, the 4th of July week. And of course, Friday is the 4th of July, and it kind of focuses on the need for us, especially as we are now moving into a time in which we'll have celebrations, 250 years of America. And some of us are old enough to remember when we had in 1976, 200-year celebration, the bicentennial. Some of you are too young to remember that, but again, I think it will be a time in which you'll probably have some who will talk about patriotism and want to talk about the greatness and some of the things that we should be grateful for in this American nation. But I do believe that the 250th anniversary is going to be very different than the 200th anniversary because there are so many individuals that are negative about this country, and that comes from the universities, it comes from the media, and it is best illustrated by this Gallup poll that just came out. I'm going to hold up some graphs. Obviously, if it had come a little bit earlier, I could have got them maybe to Karen. She could put them on her screen, but I'll hold them up, and if you can't see them, you can find them easily. We may even post it later in the week anyway, because I think issue of patriotism very significant. Partially because if you don't hear about the evidence of God's providence, even in the forming of this country, and if you're unaware of how important Christian values and Christian ideas were in the beginning of this republic, if indeed Christian values were important in the creation of this republic, don't you think Christian values would be important in the maintenance of this republic? And of course so. But at a time when there is a rejection of biblical absolutes, even really a rejection of any kind of moral absolutes, it's not surprising that we see this. And I will hold this up. This is the latest Gallup poll that actually shows on a graph how when you ask Americans, and these are adults, are you extremely proud, very proud, moderately proud, only a little bit proud, or not proud at all? You can see one of the striking things is we had a record high back in 9/11, and we had a record low during COVID-19, and we now have a new record low. And so that illustrates again that patriotism has been on the decline. 2 years ago, if I can read from one of my commentaries, and maybe I'll do it again, this one was from a study that was done by the Wall Street Journal and University of Chicago. And this one from a couple of years ago asked this question: if you are in any particular way sort of patriotic. In other words, the question was, and it's the question that was asked over decades, and that is, do you feel that patriotism is important to you? And back in 1998, which interestingly enough, wasn't that long ago, if you think about it, 7 in 10 Americans said, yeah, patriotism is very important to me. When this came out in 2023, only a third said that. And now if you look at these numbers, it's even lower even so. So you can see that patriotism and love of country are waning and have waned rather dramatically. One writer looking at that, she said, well, it's pretty obvious. When you remove patriotism, family values, and hard work from society, and you add to it instead new values like multiculturalism, identity affiliations, and love of money, you aren't surprised that all of a sudden you see a stark increase in the deaths of despair, particularly among certain racial groups, and even intentional racial and gender identity divisions that are implemented by the elite class. And as a result, having more and more young people hate the country they live in. And when I show you this chart, what I thought was so interesting is that if you dig a little deeper, you'll recognize that there is a stark difference in patriotism. And I will hold up this chart because this chart, for those of you that can see it, show the Republicans in the red. And really, since 2001, over the last 25 years, their particular ideas about being proud of America haven't changed. Their current number is 92%. So why do we see such a precipitous decline? Well, that's because of Democrats and then some independents. And if you then even look at the chart, you realize that that decline among Democrats happened beginning in 2016. That's the election of Donald Trump. It bumped up a little bit under Joe Biden, but it's gone down even further since then. And I think it illustrates again that it isn't universal that individuals in America aren't patriotic. It isn't universal that Americans are no longer proud to be in this country. It really goes down political lines. And as we were talking about this off air, I think part of that has to do with what is being taught in the public schools. But since this is adults, I think some of that has to do with the way in which the mainstream media, the so-called legacy media, continually runs down America. And so one of the projects I want to certainly implement over this next year as we come to a celebration of 250 years of America is to do more in teaching about America's godly heritage, because that has been poorly taught or not taught at all. We certainly want to talk about some of the times in which America has been exceptional, not American exceptionalism, but certainly times in which there have been points of pride in this country. And also teach, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, some of the really dark chapters in American history. Racism and slavery certainly fit into that category, the Indian Wars and others, and certainly get an honest and fair look at this country. But anybody that looks at this country today and says, well, it's just a terrible country to live in, please explain to me why very few people are leaving this country and so many people are desperately trying to get into this country, and recognize that the kind of freedom that you have to criticize the government would not exist in places like Iran that we just talked about, or many other countries in the world. And if you wanted to practice your religious freedom, that is certainly something we are enjoying in this country, in large part because of some of the things that Kelly Shackelford and the people associated with him at First Liberty, as well as Alliance Defending Freedom, when we've talked with Lathan Watts and others, certainly give us a reason to be very encouraged about the future of this country. So if nothing else, let me just mention that that is something we are going to address. And if you find yourself even today saying you've covered quite a bit of information, I'd really like to know a little bit more, let me point you to the website, because first of all, we do have the information about the Budget Baseline Con. We also have the information about the Iranian threat, one that I'll get to in just a few minutes on the imperial presidency. And then I even gave you an update on the African Peace Treaty, something you probably didn't hear anywhere else. And when we come back from the break, I do want to pick up this one on the imperial presidency, and also just the fact that we now have a number of individuals that have defected from China who tell us that we should be very skeptical and certainly have a very close eye on individuals that come to this country from places like China, because the only way they get a visa to come from China to the United States to be visiting scholars or to be international students at our universities is by signing a contract with the Chinese government and the communists especially, so that they would actually be able to steal some of our innovative developments and some of our entrepreneurial activities and some of the various resources that we have in this country. So we'll come back and talk about that threat as well, because it's just a good illustration of the fact that we live in a dangerous world, and we certainly have talked about that. And even as we go to a break, let me just mention one more time that those of you that certainly do support this ministry probably will receive or have already received in the mail well as a holdup for you right now, the July issue of the Outlook magazine. And in there, of course, one of the key articles is about this growing axis of evil, and that would be Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Of course, also we mention, of course, the supreme leader in Iran. But we live in a dangerous world, and we should not be motivated by fear, but we live in a country where we have a greater opportunity to prevent some of the kind of abuses that we were talking about earlier with Lana Silk. And so I think, again, we should celebrate this country, as you heard William Federer talk about, and I think we need to not only encourage our children and our grandchildren, but even our teachers and other role models to really talk about in this 250th year of the anniversary of this country, to focus on some of the good things that come from this country here in the United States of America. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention that we started the program today by talking about this big, beautiful bill, and we've just had a vote to advance the legislation. It ended up being a 50-50 tie, in which the tie was broken by J.D. Vance, so 51-50, and we'll follow where that takes us. And, of course, you have now an updated draft of this mega bill, and, of course, we'll probably spend some time talking about that tomorrow tomorrow and over the next couple of days. Of course, Friday will be a vacation day for us and a time to celebrate this country because, as I said, a year from now, July 4th, 2026, will be 250 years, and that will be something we will want to build towards as well. Okay, I just mentioned real quickly, but it's worth mentioning again that we have some real concerns coming out of China, something we talk about in our latest issue of the Outlook magazine. This particular article says, many Americans are concerned about national security right now. Of course we are, because the foreign spy who defected to the United States has unveiled certainly some jaw-dropping anti-American scheme brewing. That's the writer's words, but I think it's appropriate. This is a Chinese doctor, Li Mingyan, who fled her homeland after exposing back then the controversial COVID-19 research claims that were being made by scientists there in China. And, of course, also she was saying that at the time there is a systematic attempt to steal intellectual property from the United States and turn it over to the Chinese Communist Party. She said scientists getting visas from China to the U.S. say they are visiting scholars, but they have, in order to do that, signed contracts with the Chinese government to go back to China, serve China with whatever they can get from the United States. She says that this is one of the reasons we should be concerned, and the Trump administration's taking this very seriously because they've been rigorously vetting all sorts of foreign scientists, particularly those from China, who were granted visas with the assistance from some of the federal agencies like the National Institutes of Health, NIH. And so again, Li Mingyan says that's why they get visas from the Chinese government. So from the beginning, they have already made a deal with the Chinese Communist Party and to become communists themselves and to become agents. So China has these people come here, grab your intellectual properties, grab your technologies, compromise your people, and that, she says, is like a tumor, like the parasites go into your body and into your country. Now, if you are looking for examples, the most recent one I can think of happened at the University of Michigan, right there in Ann Arbor, which you had two individuals that had been caught and were caught smuggling a toxic pathogen into the country there at that university. And so that is one of the real concerns about that. Li Mingyan also argues that these incidents are part of a deliberate Chinese strategy to weaponize U.S. research capabilities. She claims that these bioweapons that are being brought in are really targeting agriculture and are seen in some cases as a poor man's nuclear weapons in ways to disrupt America's food supply. So again, as I mentioned before, the Trump administration has a vetting initiative, launched it just a few weeks ago, and now have targeted about 1,000 scientists in this country who come from what are called countries of concern, with especially a significant focus on China. And this is, if you nothing else, a marked departure from some of the lax oversight of previous administrations that I think in many cases failed to screen researchers for their ties to the Chinese military or the Chinese Communist Party. Let me give just one other quote from Gordon Chang, and I'll leave it at that. Gordon Chang's been in studio with us, also by phone. Gordon Chang said, "We know that with the open border, thousands, tens of thousands of Chinese came, most of them desperate Chinese wanting to live in a free society. We understand that. But also," he says, especially towards the end of the Biden administration, there were lots of packs of Chinese males coming in from groups of 4 to 15. We saw them with an identical kit. And that was to actually do what they can to smuggle in and even possibly be another one of those concerning sleeper cells, as we just talked about a few minutes ago with Iran. So anyway, just wanted to bring that particular story to you as well, because I don't know how often that particular story is getting coverage in the mainstream press. But I thought I'd end with Charles Cook. He takes on one of the writers in the New York Times because, as hard as it is to believe, at a time when we've had all sorts of presidents that have, in some cases, wanted to violate the law. There has been a willingness on the part of even people, in this case, a person writing for the New York Times, to turn a blind eye to anything that Barack Obama has done or anything that Joe Biden has done, and to focus almost exclusively on Donald Trump. This is Charles Savage, who talks about this issue of the imperial presidency and points out that really presidential power historically has gone from ebbs and flows. It's been, he says, sometimes on an upward path from the middle of the 20th century, and that's why Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, referred to the imperial presidency. And that was a phrase that was tagged to Richard Nixon. But even interestingly enough, Charles Savage acknowledges really during the 1970s that didn't last very long because we had the Watergate scandal, we had the end of the Vietnam War, and certainly Richard Nixon, even, say, Jimmy Carter. But then he starts arguing that, but with Ronald Reagan, and especially after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, we've seen something else. And so I like Charles Cook says, you got it? After a nameless and faceless phenomenon led mysteriously by the growth of the administrative state inside the executive branch, the presidency grew imperial only at the hands of Republicans. This imperialism began in an upward path under Eisenhower, came so bad under Nixon, the other branch felt they had to do something about it. It increased in severity under Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and, of course, under Donald Trump, but nowhere else. And then goes on to talk about how Congress has failed to really control this so-called imperial presidency. By the way, I partially would agree. The Patriot Act under George W. Bush and some other abuses along the way, I certainly would figure some of that is appropriate. But then Charles Cook ends by this. Naturally, of course, this is great news for Times readers who will now have the confirmation they've had all along. It's the Democratic presidents, when they try to spend $500 billion without legislative approval or decree changes to immigration law, which they previously insisted they were unable to make, or illegally order vaccine mandates and eviction memoranda in defiance of a statute, or use the EPA to achieve aims they could not get through Congress, or go through Libya without permission. Well, that's all different. But we should, under no circumstances, allow some of the things that are happening under Donald Trump. And again, I always want to say to some of these writers, if you were to even acknowledge that some of these abuses that Charles Cook pointed out happened under Obama and Biden, then I think I'd be a little more open to some of the criticism you have about George W. Bush or Donald Trump. But given the fact that it's always the Republicans that are bad, and there's never even an acknowledgement that some of this abuse happened under Democrats, that makes it hard for us to take seriously some of those arguments. I gave you just a short summary, but it is kind of fun. Charles Cook is really having some fun poking out some of the hypocrisy and inconsistencies in an article in the New York Times. And I thought it'd just be a good way to remind you that it's important to read widely, and just because it's in the New York Times doesn't necessarily make it true. That's all we have for today. Tomorrow we're going to get back into some of the issues in the news. We're also going to talk about biblical interpretation. I think you'll appreciate that as well. So first of all, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.